Tonight I want to do something a little bit different than normal, and I went to do a Bible study for Braden, because Braden happens to be the ripe old age of 6, and that's a significant number, at least according to Albert Einstein it was. And so I want to talk about how to teach, and I want to show you how to teach sovereign grace to a 6-year-old. It's important that we are able to explain things simply, anything that we do. And we all admire somebody that can make something complex simple, right? The guy that can explain something and make it make sense to you whenever somebody else has tried to explain it and, blathered on for an hour and you have no more idea of what to do than when you first asked. But somebody that can just give you 3 sentences and explain something, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's what we should endeavor to do. The doctrine of sovereign grace is no exception. It's going to be a little more than 3 sentences tonight and tomorrow night, or next week. But Albert Einstein said, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. And I think that there's some truth in that. Because now, granted, I suppose that there are some things, like some of the things that Einstein dabbled in, which would be pretty hard to explain to a 6-year-old. For that matter, I don't think Einstein could explain some of his theories to anybody, because he said he himself didn't even understand the equations that he did. And I think some of his theories were kind of bunk. But anyway, that's an aside. William Lane Craig, in his book Reasonable Faith, said we should know our subject profoundly and share it simply. And I think that's really important as a preacher, to be able to know our subject profoundly. We should know the scriptures inside and out as best as we possibly can. But when you explain it, we don't have to explain it like we're some kind of a PhD theologian and make everybody think how smart we are because we know all these big highfalutin terms, right? We should explain it simply. And then Aristotle, who was no dummy, he was one of the most famous philosophers, he said, think as wise men do, but speak as the common people do. And I think that's wise too. There are some people out there that are called popularizers, right? That there are some people that are theoreticians. I don't know if that's a word or not, but anyway, they do the theorizing of various things, philosophy or other of the sciences, and then there are other people out there that popularize them, and they write them for the average guy. So they're both important. So this outline is designed to be used to teach sovereign grace to a 6-year-old. And this study is going to be aimed at you, Braden. So what I need to do in my mind is get it straight that I'm speaking to Braden. And I'm going to be speaking only to Braden. The rest of you are just here as spectators. I'm not speaking to any of you. I'm going to be speaking directly to Braden. And that's really necessary because if a preacher tries to preach a sermon to children and he's not in his mind specifically speaking to the children and only to the children, what ends up happening is it goes right over the kid's head, and he's really speaking to the adults, pretending to be speaking to the kids, and the kids don't get a word of it, and he's not really talking to the kids. And that's what I don't want to do. So I'm going to try to effectively communicate this to Braden. So from this point forward, I'm talking to Braden, okay? And Braden, I'll be asking you some questions, and you can answer them. And if you don't know the answer to them, you can just say, I don't know. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with not knowing, okay? So we're going to talk about sovereign grace tonight. Have you ever heard the words sovereign grace? No, okay. So you probably have, you just don't remember, because I probably have mentioned it a few thousand times in sermons during your lifetime. But it probably just didn't sink in when you heard it, because maybe you didn't understand it, right? So I'm going to try to help you to understand it tonight. So we're going to look at both of those words. We'll look at sovereign and we'll look at grace. So do you know what a sovereign is?
I don't know.
Nope. Okay. Well, that's a big word, and when you're 6, you probably wouldn't know what that word is. So what a sovereign is it describes what a king does. You know what a king is, right? Like a king's the guy that's in charge of a country, right? And he tells people what to do, and he makes laws and things like that, right? Well, a king is a ruler, and he does whatever he wants. So nobody tells him what to do. Right, the king, he does whatever he feels like doing. Right, that's what a sovereign does. He tells people what to do. Right, so the king, he's that guy that everybody wishes they could be. He's the guy that gets to boss everybody around. Right, that's what a sovereign is. Now, God is the ruler of the whole earth. Right, like a king is only the ruler of a country, but God is the ruler of everything. So every person, God is king over. So God is a sovereign, a king over the whole world. And God controls everything. God tells everybody what to do, right? And nobody tells him what to do. And God never has to ask anybody what he can do, right? He just tells people what to do. That's what a sovereign does. Now, how about grace? Do you know what grace is? Have you ever heard that word? Do you know what that means? No. Okay. So grace is when somebody does something nice for you when they don't have to. Right? So sometimes somebody might be obligated to do something nice for you because maybe they promised to or something. But grace would be whenever they don't owe you anything nice and they do it anyway. I'll give you an example. Like, say your daddy tells you, Braden, don't you run in this house. And if you run, you're going to get a spanking. Right? Has your dad ever told you that before? Yep. Okay, so this is a good example then. So don't run, or you're going to get a spanking. And if you run in the house then, what do you deserve? A spanking. You deserve a spanking, right? Because that's what your daddy said, right? Now, if you run in the house and your daddy spanks you for it, you got what you deserved, right? Right? He gave you what he promised, right? Nothing wrong with that. But if you run in the house and your daddy decides to not spank you, he showed grace to you. Now, it might not be a wise thing to do, because if he says he should spank you, then he should. But maybe he just, for some reason, decides he's going to be nice to you, and he's just not going to give you what you deserve. That's grace. He showed grace to you. He held back from punishing you when you deserved it. Okay? So that's what grace means. So sovereign grace means that God chooses to not punish some people for their sins that they commit, and instead be nice to them, be kind to them. So when people sin, and we'll talk about what sin is in just a second, but when people do bad things and God could and should punish them for it, sometimes he decides that he won't punish them for it. And that is God's grace. So why do we need God's grace then? You have any idea why we would need God's grace? Well, we have a problem. We're sinners. You know what a sinner is? Okay, so a sinner is somebody that does something bad, does something against what God has told us to do. It says in Romans 3 and verse 23, I'm going to give you some Bible verses. Romans 3 and verse 23 says, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." So that means that every one of us has sinned. It means every one of us has done something bad, something disobedient. You know what disobedient means? When you don't do what you're supposed to, right? Whenever your dad tells you not to run and you run, that's disobedience, right? So you're breaking a commandment.
I think I've heard disobedience before, but I never know what it means.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's the opposite of obedience. So to obey is to do what you're told. To disobey is to not do what you're told. Yep. So sin is when we break God's law, when we do something that God tells us not to. In other words, when we do bad things. We're told in 1 John 3 and verse 4, this is another big word, but I will explain it too. 1 John 3:4 says, "Whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law, for sin is the transgression of the law." So to transgress means to go beyond something. So like if there was a border where you're not supposed to go past this, like maybe the driveway in your house, at your house, or the road in front of your house, and you're not supposed to go on that road, if you walked on the road, you have transgressed. You went over the border to something you're not supposed to do. That's what a transgression is. So sin is whenever we transgress or we go over the law. When Dad says don't run, and you run, you have gone over the law, right? You've broken the law. That's a transgression. So this could be something like when we sin, that could be disobeying your parents, right? Because God tells you to obey your parents. So you're not only disobeying your dad, but you're disobeying God if you don't do what your dad says. Or a sin could be stealing, when you take something that's not yours.
Yeah.
Or lying, right? Whenever you say something that's not true, all right? So any of those things would be considered sin, breaking God's law. Now the thing is, we are all born sinners. Did you know that? Even little babies. right? They're born sinners because they right away start doing bad things and start doing things that they are not supposed to do. Do you know who the first man was that ever lived on the earth?
God.
No, not God. Who's the first man God created? Do you remember? Remember his name? His name was Adam. Remember Adam? You ever heard of Adam and Eve? Yep. So Adam was the first man, and God created him, and he put him in a garden. It was a beautiful place. And he told Adam that he was supposed to tend to the garden. He was supposed to keep it. You know, like your parents have a garden and they go out there and they weed it, right? And they keep it looking nice. So that was what Adam was supposed to do whenever he was put in the Garden of Eden. But he was told in Genesis 2 and verse 17, "But the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die." So there was this one tree in the garden, and it was called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And Adam could eat of any other tree in the garden, but that one tree he was not allowed to eat from. And God said, if you do, you'll die the day that you eat it. Well, the devil came in the form of a snake, a serpent, and he tempted Adam's wife, Eve, to eat. And he deceived her and tricked her. And she ate, and then she gave it to her husband, to Adam, and he ate it. We're told in Genesis 3:6, "And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desired to make one wise, she took the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat." So God said, if you eat of that tree, you're going to die. And then Adam ate of the tree. So what does that mean happened to Adam?
He died.
He died, right. See, you understand things that most Christians that have been going to church for 50 years don't understand. They don't understand he died that day. They don't get that. So good job. So Adam died. And then what happened was, see, Adam actually lived a long time after that, though. He didn't die, his body didn't die, but something inside him died. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. Because God said in the day, so that very day, whenever he ate, he did die. Something inside happened to him. And then when Adam had kids, when he had children, they were all born sinners like Adam was. Because remember, sin is whenever you do what God says not to do. And God said don't eat. And Adam ate, he became a sinner. And when Adam had children, they all became sinners just like him. In Romans 5 and verse 12.
Like nobody should eat poisonous gooseberries.
Right, exactly. Because if you did that, you'd probably die too. Yes, so whenever your dad tells you not to eat something in the garden or in the woods, you should listen. Because if you don't, you might die. Nobody wants that. Romans 5 and verse 12. It says, "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned." So when Adam sinned and he ate that fruit, he died inside. And whenever he had children, they were born just like he was, dead inside. And I'll talk about what that means here in just a second. So they were just like he was. They were no longer perfect. Because when Adam was created, he was perfect. But after he sinned, he was no longer perfect. And his children were born just like him, not perfect. So children inherit things from their parents. You know what it means to inherit? So to inherit means to get something given to you. Like sometimes whenever grandparents die, then they leave things to their children, and that's called an inheritance because they give them the things that they had, and they give them to their children. So sometimes kids look like their parents. Like, you ever wonder why you have that red hair? It's because your mom has red hair. And it's because your grandma used to have red hair before she started dyeing it white. Used to be red. Aunt Carrie's hair is red. Your great Aunt Linda's hair is red. Right? There's a lot of redheads in your family. That's why you have red hair.
Uncle Denny's even red hair.
Mm-hmm. Uncle Willie too, right? He used to have red hair. So that's why you have that, because you got that from your parents. Sometimes kids talk like their parents. Right? You'll hear them and they say the same kinds of things as their parents. Well, the thing is, they also inherit their spiritual nature from their parents. Now that's probably a complicated sounding thing. Spiritual nature. Do you know what a spiritual nature is? Okay, so spirit, you know what spiritual is?
No.
So spiritual is something that is not material. Like your bodies are material. You can touch and feel your body, right? There's something to it there. But the spirit is something that you can't touch. It's like God. You can't touch him, right? He's out there. He's in heaven, but you can't touch him. He's not made up of a body like we are. Jesus is, but God, the Father, is not. So our spiritual nature is what makes us think and act the way that we do. Like, you ever wonder why you think the things you think, or why you act the way you do? You know, most 6-year-olds probably don't wonder and ponder those things. But if you think about it, the reason why you think what you think and do what you do, why you decide to do certain things, is because you have something inside you telling you what to do and making you want to do certain things. That's called your spirit. Okay? So that thing inside telling you what to think, that's your spirit. Your spirit's kind of like an instinct that animals have. You know what an instinct is? So an instinct is something that is born into you, that you just do certain things without even thinking about it. So like with animals, like for instance birds, they build nests. Right? You ever see a bird build a nest? You ever see a bird nest before?
Yeah.
Right?
Sometimes.
Yep.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm. So the bird, he just builds that nest just because something in him just tells him to build a nest. Like his parents never taught him how to build a nest. He's not born knowing how to build a nest, but one day something just tells him inside, I got to build a nest. That's kind of like his spirit inside telling him to do something. Or groundhogs, they dig holes. You ever see a groundhog hole?
How many birds leave the air because it gets cold?
Mm-hmm.
They don't know that really.
Mm-hmm. Like groundhog holes, right? Groundhogs, nobody tells them to dig a hole. They just know. Something inside them tells them to do it.
Most holes are probably not from groundhogs, because normally when I see holes, they're normally from snakes.
From snakes, yeah. Or moles, or there are a lot of things that make holes too. Or like bees, they build hives, right? But nobody tells them to do that. They just know.
Or a nest.
Or a nest, right? So our spiritual nature causes us to want to do bad things without even being taught to do so. Like, did your parents ever sit you down and teach you how to lie? They never told you how to lie, did they? They told you not to lie, but you probably lied before, haven't you? Yeah. But they never told you to do that, and they never taught you to do that, right? There was just something within you that wanted you to do that. That's your spirit. That's that dead little reprobate spirit within you, telling you to do bad things. So our spirit causes us to want to do bad things, and we haven't even been taught to do so. When your parents tell you to do something and you don't want to do it, your nature makes you not want to do it. Because why don't you just always want to do what your parents tell you to do? Because you just don't want to, right? There's just something in you that just says, I don't want to do what they tell me to do. I want to do what I want to do.
Yeah, it's the spirit.
Mm-hmm. That's your spiritual nature. It's telling you to do that. So when God tells you to do something that you don't want to do, like obeying your parents or not hitting other kids or something like that, your nature makes you not want to do it. So God says obey your parents, but something inside you is telling you, I don't want to obey my parents, right? God tells you don't hit other people, and somebody makes you mad, you just want to whack them upside the head, right? You don't want to listen to what God says, because there's just something in you that wants to do whatever you want to do. That's your spirit. And we can't change our evil nature. Just like birds can't stop building nests, or groundhogs can't stop digging holes, or bees can't stop making hives. They're just going to do that because that's just what they do, right? Something within them tells them to do that. The bird's never going to decide one day just to start digging a hole. And the groundhog's never going to decide to build a nest. And neither is the bee. So our spiritual nature, it makes us bad people, right? That's why people do all kinds of bad things out there. And there's mean people out there, and they're not nice to other people, and that's why.
If they do something bad, they go to prison.
That's right. That's why we have prisons, to to keep people from doing bad things.
And to keep other people safe.
That's right. That's exactly why we have that. So our spiritual nature will not allow us to seek God or do things that he tells us to do. Let's look at Romans chapter 3, 9 through 12. It says, "What then? Are we better than they? No, in no wise. For we have before proved, both Jews and Gentiles, that they are all under sin." So every one of us is under sin. That means we're all sinners. We all do bad things. "As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one." So not one single person does righteous things. Righteous things are good things, right? But none of us do those things, not on our own. "There is none that understandeth, there is none that seeketh after God." So to seek means to look for. But none of us are looking for God, right? We don't want anything to do with God, right? We want God to leave us alone because God tells us to do things that we don't want to do, right? We just want him to stay away. "They are all gone out of the way. They are together become unprofitable. There's none that doeth good, no, not one." That's what we're like. We don't like to do good things because we just want to do whatever we want to do, right? In fact, our spiritual nature is so incapable, so unable to do the things that God tells us to do, that it's called dead. In Ephesians 2 in verse 1. Ephesians 2:1, it says, "And you hath he quickened." You know what it means to quicken? No, neither do most people. It means to be made alive. Like if somebody is dead and they're quickened, it means they're brought back to life. "And you hath he quickened who were dead in trespasses and in sins." So have you ever seen a dead person before at a funeral? You ever go to a funeral and you see that big box up front, the casket, and there's a dead person in there?
Like when Kate died.
Like when Cade died, yep. Well, when Cade was up there in the coffin, in the box, and he was dead, he wasn't able to do anything, was he? Like if you would have said, "Hey, Cade, why don't you sit up?" Cade couldn't have done anything, right? Because he was dead, right? If you say, "Hey, Cade, here's a glass of water, take a drink." Cade couldn't have done that, could he? Because he was dead. He couldn't do anything. He couldn't talk. He couldn't walk. He couldn't say anything. He couldn't hear, right? He couldn't see anything because he was dead.
He would just be laying there.
Just laying there. Can't do anything. And that's the same way it is when a person is spiritually dead. When that thing inside of you that makes you want to do things, when it's dead, as the Bible says that it is, it can't do anything for God, right? It can't know God, or it can't understand God, it can't believe in God, it can't obey God. And that's why that people do all these bad things, because it's as if they're dead inside. They just, like Cade, just couldn't do anything. Well, the people can't do anything good because their spirit is just totally lifeless.
Yeah, it's just like they're frozen like a statue.
That's right. Spiritual statues, that's right. So the only way that a dead man can ever come back to life is for God to resurrect him. You know what resurrect means? That's another big word. To resurrect means to make somebody come back to life. That's what happened to Jesus. You remember Jesus died and he went into the grave for 3 days and he laid in there and he was totally dead. And then in 3 days, God raised him from the dead. He resurrected him and Jesus came back to life. And then he went back to heaven. So that's the only way that a person can come back to life, is if God makes him come back to life. And in the same way, the only way for a man who is spiritually dead to have spiritual life so that he can believe and obey God is for God to resurrect him spiritually. He's got to change something inside of him. This means to make him alive spiritually so that he thinks differently and he wants to obey God and he wants to make God happy. And so something has to be changed within us if we're going to want to make God happy. We're told that in Ephesians 2, 1 through 5, but I'm not going to read that because I know it's getting late. I just got a few more points here I want to make, okay? Can you hang with me for a few more minutes? Okay, all right. So, we have a problem because God is holy and we're not. You know what holy means? So, holy means when somebody is totally good, right? They don't do anything bad. They're perfect. There's nothing wrong with them at all. That's what it means to be holy. So that means that God is perfect and he never does anything bad. So everything that God does is good. It's always right. God never thinks of anything bad. Right? You know, you think of bad things, right? We all think of bad things. But God never thinks of anything bad. Never. God is perfectly clean. In heaven, where God lives, is perfectly clean. Nothing dirty there, nothing filthy there, nothing bad. And because God is that holy, because he is so good and perfect, he can't even look at sinners like us, people that do bad things that he tells them not to do. Habakkuk 1 and verse 13 tells us this. Can you imagine, you have those cute little puppies at your house, right? Can you imagine if you came home and you heard those puppies barking and somebody was back there just beating on your puppies? You wouldn't like that, right? That's mean. Right? You wouldn't even want to see somebody do that, right? You wouldn't even want to look at that. That's how God feels when he looks at us doing bad things. God's just like, I don't even want to look at that. That just makes him sick, makes him angry. Habakkuk 1 and verse 13 says, Thou art of purer eyes than to behold evil, and canst not look on iniquity. Iniquity is another word for sin, or doing bad things that God says not to. So his eyes are so pure, they are so good, that he can't even look at evil, at bad things, at people that do bad things. And sinners, therefore, can't live with God in heaven, because God's not going to let them in. God doesn't even want to see that kind of thing. He doesn't want to, would you want some mean person, some really mean, bad, nasty person to come and live with you in your house? No, somebody that's just constantly walking up and hitting you and calling you names and doing things like that. You wouldn't want somebody living in your house like that, right? God doesn't want anybody like that living in his house either. In heaven, he doesn't want anybody up there like that. Psalm 5 and verse 4. It says, Thou art not a God that hath pleasure in wickedness, neither shall evil dwell with thee. To dwell means to live. And so evil can't come and live with God in heaven. He doesn't want any of that. Now, when we sin, there's a punishment for it, right? When you do something bad, there's always a punishment, right? You know what the punishment for sin is? It's death. Remember what God told Adam, that if he ate of that tree, that he would die, right? It says in Romans 6:23 that the wages of sin is death. A wage is something that you get paid for. When you do something and somebody owes you something, that's a wage. Well, whenever you sin, God gives you death. That's why people die, because they sin. Now, the death is eternal punishment in hell. You know what hell is? It's a place where bad people go. And it's really hot there. It's burning and fire. It's dark. It's just a bad place. Nobody wants to go there. But that's where God sends people that are sinners, people that don't obey his law. Luke 16 and verse 23, it says, And in hell he lift up his eyes, being in torments, and seeth Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. This was a bad man, and he went to hell. He was suffering there. This is what God does to people that sin, because he must punish them. Now, if we're judged by God for the bad things that we've done, we get sent to the lake of fire at the end of time. That's what it teaches us in Revelation 20, verses 12 through 15. Because someday, after we all die, we're all going to be resurrected, both the good and the bad. Everybody's going to stand before God, and they're all going to be judged. And he's going to determine which of them are given heaven and which of them are given punishment in the lake of fire. Revelation 20, 12 through 15. It says, And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books, according to their works. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them, and they were judged every man according to their works. And death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. So people that are judged according to the bad things that they've done, they go to a lake of fire. And that would be really hot and really painful. That would not be any fun. We don't want to go there. That's why we need God's grace. Remember what grace is? Remember what grace is? Grace is whenever God does something nice for you when he doesn't have to. Right? When you deserve something bad, some punishment, God does something nice for you. That's why we need God's grace, because otherwise we would end up going to hell, going to a really bad, scary place, and we don't want to go there. So if God doesn't show grace to us, we will get what we deserve and be punished in